like to welcome everyone today. We want to thank you for joining us. We know that everything is hectic right now, but we appreciate you being here. My name is Sarah Rush, and I am joined by my colleague Diane Veely. We're school improvement specialists at the Indiana Department of Education. We want to welcome you to Closing the Achievement Gap, identifying high priority standards, and creating instructional calendars for ELA, K through 8, and math as well. So right below the YouTube video, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that there's a link to the presentation shared under the information section. If you click on that, you will be forced to create a copy of our presentation. And the reason that we did that is so that you can present it or edit it for your own school and use it as you see fit. And then also to the right of the YouTube presentation, you'll see that there's a chat box. That is where you can ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer those as we go, or at the end, or even in one of our deeper dives that we are holding next week. So again, right below the YouTube video, you'll see the presentation link, and then to the right is where you can ask questions in the chat box. So feel free to ask any questions as we move along. So now as we look at these past few months, obviously they've been in a huge adjustment for all, and really teachers and leaders have done such an amazing job at completely shifting gears and doing their best and doing what's best for kids. So with all of that being said, though, we really are approaching the time where we need to start looking forward and planning for next year, whether we're just beginning that process or continuing on that process. And today what we're really going to focus on is how to identify learning gaps, prioritizing standards, and also the creation of flexible learning, flexible instructional calendars. This session is really just the overview of the process of identifying high priority standards and creating instructional calendars. Next week, when you signed up for this session, you also signed up for a session. The first one will be really a deeper dive into identifying those high priority standards and skill gaps. And then the second session will be actually the creation of the instructional calendars for the 2021 school year. So we will get started. So obviously, I just said this, but learning gaps occur, right? They occur every year, whether there's remote learning or not. But when you couple summer months with remote learning, the gaps can be, enhanced. And so if you'll see here, on NWEA did a study on the quote unquote COVID slide, which is just projected learning gaps and learning gains. Preliminary slide estimates suggest students will return in fall 2020 with about 70% of the learning gains in reading relative to a typical school year. And then in math, students are likely to show even smaller learning gains, returning with less than 50% of the learning gains in some grades, and then nearly a full year behind for some students than what we normally observe in normal conditions. So obviously those are staggering numbers, but I promise that it's not all bad and there is good news. There are things you as leaders and teachers of both groups on here can really do to minimize those gaps. And it really revolves around focusing on the most essential skills for each student. So we'll get started. If you've ever been a part of any of our professional development, typically we travel around the state and do our professional development, but we always start off with the objectives, really modeling what does this look like in a classroom. So when we look at the objectives for today, many of you have previously, I know, identified high priority standards, but this session is really to help you realign your priorities. It's now more important than ever to really reduce the amount of content that we're trying to cover with kids and figuring out what is the most important for them for that grade level and for continued grade levels. So the overview today will really serve as a framework for you. It's an outline, and again, more detail will be coming next Monday or Tuesday, depending on what session you signed up for. So the first objective is to really outline the process to identify high priority standards for K through 8 ELA and math. Our goal is to extend this PD eventually to other grade levels and content areas because we get asked that all the time. Right now, we're sticking with just K through 8 ELA and math. Of our series will take you on a deeper dive, like I said, that will go more in depth on this. And then our second objective for the session is to really outline the process of creating instructional calendars. And we want these to be high quality and adaptable for the 2021 school year. And these are really going to be the roadmap for teachers, prioritizing what's the most important. So this all works together, and then we want them to address any learning gaps as well. In the third part of our series at the end of next week, depending what session you signed up for, we'll take a deeper dive into this instructional calendar piece as well. So let's look at the process. Like I said earlier, it's all about what's the most essential, what's the most critical at each grade level. As leaders, you see the title at the top, focused instruction. It's so critical for you to promote this idea within your buildings, within your districts, with your teachers, because this really is reducing the amount of material teachers are trying to cover in each class, and reduces what they're prioritizing in each class. So what's the most important at each grade level? When you look at this slide, you'll see really where we're going with this. You see that there's 6 steps. So the first 3 really revolve around the identification of high priority standards. In step 1, you're going to determine these high priority standards. Some people call them power standards, essential standards, high priority standards. They have about 100 different names. It's all the same idea, though, the most critical skills. Now, the second step, we're going to talk about previous grade level standards that are connected to your high priority standard. Is going to be the step that will help you address skill gaps over the summer months as well as remote learning. And then in step 3, you're going to compare the two. So what are students learning right now? What's the most important things for students to learn right now? And what would the previous grade look like? And I will say this, this is a best practice to look at the previous grade level and identify any learning gaps is a best practice, whether this remote learning happened or not. This is something that you should be doing in continuous years to come. Then we'll shift gears a little bit when we get to step 4. That's where the instructional calendar piece starts. And in that instructional calendar piece, we're going to, identify how many days are we working with, estimate how long each of these high priority standards will really take. And then the most time consuming piece in step 6 is mapping them all out in a sequence that makes sense, and then also incorporating in assessments as you go. And here's where teachers can kind of combine prerequisite skills and similar skills in a way that makes sense. So I'm going to turn it over to Diane now, and she's going to help walk you through the first couple steps in some more detail.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. This is Diane, and I want to start by just briefly walking you through what an iLearn blueprint looks like, where to access it, and how to read it. So if you look at the screen, this is a sample of a 7th grade ELA blueprint, but using this link right here to the side will take you to the site where anyone in grades 3 through 8 can access the blueprint for their grade level and content that they want to look at. So you'll notice that it lists the standards in the second column, and next to the standards is a column called the standard item range. And I want to explain that a little bit more so that those numbers make a little bit more sense to you. If you notice next to 7.RL.2.1, there's a minimum number of a 1 and a maximum of a 3. And that indicates that for that standard on the iLearn test, every student is going to encounter at least 1 question, and some students will have up to 3 questions. And that is because the test is adaptive, so it depends on how they're answering, how many questions they get. But every student is assured for 7.RL.2.1 to have a question. So according to the guidance we received from the Office of Assessment, that standard is then considered a high priority since every student is guaranteed to encounter it on the test. Same thing with 7.RL.2.2. Then you'll see we have some outlined in yellow, and these are considered our medium priority. What the 0 in the minimum range means is that not every student every year will have a question from that standard, but some students could have up to 2 questions. So we still need to make sure we've given some attention to that, but maybe not as much as the standard that everyone's going to encounter. Then you'll notice the green boxes, the 0 to 1, following that same logic. Not every student every year will encounter that standard, but some students could encounter up to 1, depending on how that adaptive test adapts for how they're doing. Occasionally, you will encounter, I know on 3rd grade, and there's a couple other blueprints where you'll see a range from a 1 to 2. And we're encouraging you guys, you're the experts, use your professional judgment. That means that every student is going to get at least one question and they'll have up to two. So whether you're going to consider that a high priority or a medium priority is truly up to you. You know your students the best, and you know what they're capable of. But just some things to think about when you are making that decision. Think about, is every student going to encounter that standard on iLearn? Have they been exposed to that standard either in the previous grade level or in your current grade level? Or do I have any assessment data to back it up? So those considerations could help you balance it. I know in third grade there's a lot. I believe it's on the math blueprint. There are several 1 to 2, excuse me, and there's no way possible to make all of them a high priority because we have so many deep and rigorous standards that to devote the time and attention to them in your instruction you just wouldn't be able to do it justice. So critically analyzing those standards and thinking about what you need to make the highest priority. You'll notice on here we left off some of the coding. So this group of standards right here are kind of blocked together. They are considered a high priority, and that's the 7.RN.2.1 and the 6 through 8 LH 2.1 and LST. Don't feel badly if you're thinking, what in the world are these codes? Because I have never taught above 5th grade, so I didn't know. The LH stands for literacy and history, and the LST is literacy in science and technology. So they coupled those together because those would lend themselves nicely when you're teaching some nonfiction strategies. You could bring in some historical documents and use some technology along with it. Same goes for 7.RN.2.2. Those are meant to be taught together, and as well as this medium priority of RN.2.3. Then we have one more medium priority down here, this vocabulary, and then two lesser priorities. Next to the standard item range is the standard percent of test, and this is simply just another way of breaking down that same information. So instead of talking about the number of questions, they're just talking about the percentage of the test that goes to that standard. So hopefully that cleared up any questions you might have. Again, this link is the easiest access to get to those blueprints. And once you get there, I highly encourage bookmarking that page so that you can you're just a click away from it. Remember, if you have any questions about anything I'm saying, throw it in the chat box and we'll do our best to get those answered. So we're going to jump into the first step in which you are going to utilize those iLearn blueprints to identify your current grade level's high priority standards. We can't stress enough that students need to be exposed to their current grade level standards. So we'll jump into what do I do about the gaps that occurred over the summer and through COVID. But for now, we're going to focus on our current grade level and what is the highest priority. So if you teach in a tested grade, 3 through 8 ELA or math, you're just going to follow those steps I talked about on the slide with the blueprint. But I want to address for just a quick minute our K through 2 folks. I spent a number of years in 2nd grade, and you want to be a part, you want to help, but you don't really know how you fit in with that iLearn testing because you're not included in, there's not a framework. But we have this process that you can also utilize in your K through 2 areas. So what you will do is for kindergarten through 2nd grade, we are suggesting that you identify all of the 3rd grade high priority standards for ELA and math. And you would do that just by clicking on the iLearn blueprints and going to the 3rd grade document. Once you've identified what's a high, medium, low priority for 3rd grade, then we suggest that you pull up the vertical articulation guides that we've linked here, ELA and math. Now, I will warn you, ELA is very straightforward. All of the standards align just across one row. Math is a little bit trickier, and so when we do the deeper dive, I'll show you a little trick, a little workaround for that one. But what you would want to do, once you find the 3rd grade standard on that articulation chart, trace it back to what it looks like in your grade level. Then have a conversation with your grade level team about, could that be a high priority in your grade level? We understand you guys are working hard on laying those foundational skills, and we want you to continue to prioritize that. But sometimes some of those standards from third grade and kindergarten, you could easily slip into a read aloud or any of the whole group work that you're doing. So, but it is really, really important that your whole grade level team be a part of that decision and work in unison. And ultimately, the dream is that all of those third grade high priority standards were made a priority somewhere between kindergarten and second grade, because then that's really laying some of that foundation work. When they get to third grade, they're sitting in a really nice spot. But again, we are not asking you to teach third grade standards, just looking at what that standard looks like in your grade level. And it may not, that standard may not even start in your grade level if you're kindergarten. So addressing that and then figuring out how to best prepare our students. Again, if you have any questions, don't forget to throw those in that chat box. So during this work time, you want to make sure that you've set aside adequate time for the grade level teams to dive into those blueprints and make their list of high priority standards, but not just the high priority. You want to make sure there's time for them to go back and complete the same process for the medium priority and the lesser priority. We are not saying, I'm not allowed to say, you know, we're going to cut content, we're going to take it off your plate, but we're just going to realign the emphasis or the way we approach those standards. So some of the lesser priorities might be able to be covered with bell work or in small group, or if you give a pretest, your students may already have a grasp of that concept. So we're just kind of rearranging everything that's on your plate, not necessarily taking it off. But it is important to make sure you have adequate time for discussion and work on this. So for step 2, this is where we're going to begin. This is kind of our new step that we're recommending, is once I've got my list of my high priority standards, then I'm going to go back into the vertical articulation charts or through the frameworks, and I'm going to identify the prerequisite skill from the grade level previously that directly links to my high priority standards. So I wouldn't do it for all of your standards, but definitely for your high priority standards, what were those prerequisite skills that they need to make sure they had proficiency at so they're ready to go at grade level? Because again, it's critical we're exposing our students to their current grade level high priority standards. So when you're completing step 2, again, we need to have time, and we need to encourage grade level teams to begin those vertical conversations with other teamworks. But it's most important that your grade level team is working together as one unit and creating a common list of what is a high priority, a medium priority, and lesser priority for the grade level. Step 3 is where we're going to look at those prerequisite skills and those high priority standards and try to identify any learning gaps that might be occurring. So when you're trying to decide if there are learning gaps, there's a few things to consider. What did they learn last year, or what did they not learn? And not just at the end of the year during COVID. Does the previous year's teacher have any data to show me maybe in October they had assessed one of their standards that is a prerequisite skill for my standard? Do you have data? Did they master it? Were they at proficiency? Is it something that's going to need a little bit of reteach, or are we good to go with that? And also, what is it that's critical for them to know for the 2021 school year? Once you've completed and you've identified all those prerequisite skills, then it's really, really super important to unpack all of those standards and look at the I can statements that are involved in them. And they can be called I can statements, essential skills, all sorts of things. And you can, we'll dive into that in the next PD, and we'll look at where that work's been done for you on the framework. But super important to know all the parts of that go into making that standard, and not just the first part of the standard. A lot of times we forget what happens after the verb in the standard. So we'll take a deeper dive into that. So during this work time, this is again when those vertical conversations need to come into play. This is, I will admit, the most time-consuming step, but it is the most critical. We need to consider the learning targets of each standard and have conversations about where we need to go with that. So the frameworks are going to be extremely useful when you get to this step. And we're going to look at it a lot more in depth, as I've said, but I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to walk you through instructional calendars.
Thank you, Diane. So, yeah, like she said, this is really just the beginning of the process. So please don't get overwhelmed by the steps involved in this. These are going to take time. And those first three that we just talked about, again, you'll have a lot more work time and time to ask questions as you work through it on Monday or Tuesday, depending which one you signed up for. So when we look here, now that all these high priority standards have hypothetically been identified and you used iLearn blueprints like Diane was talking about, vertical articulation charts, taking into account skill gaps, the IDOE frameworks. Where we go next is this instructional calendar piece, and that's where we're really going to put everything together. So if you have previously, again, attended one of our professional developments, we really want to provide flexibility for whatever works best. There are best practices, but with some of these things, it's really what works best for you and your teachers. So in step 4, our first thing that we have to do when thinking about instructional calendars is figure out how many days we're working with. If you have been in the classroom or even just as leaders, you know that every single instructional day counts. Things come up all the time, and that's another instructional day missed. And so in step 4, what you're going to do is you're going to have a blank 2021 calendar, and then you're going to mark off all the holidays, professional development days, testing windows, etc., all those types of things that occur throughout the school year, which means that you would need your own school year, your school district's calendar in order to do this, so you can actually see when those breaks were occurring. And this is really going to allow you, as well as your teachers, to figure out how many days are going to be allocated for direct instruction. On the right of the screen, you see a few resources. Again, this comes back to the idea of we want you to use what works best. So we have paper pencil option. It's the printable calendar that's at the top. And you'll see an example of this later, but if you use this one, we always recommend using Post-it. It's really easy to write the standards on Post-its, and it's really easy to manipulate them around once you're working with your grade level team. This should go in September or October. It'll be easy to go more in depth on that. And then below that, you'll see that there's 2 options for electronic calendars, which may be beneficial during this time when teachers may not be able to meet together physically. They're able to share this calendar electronically, and I'll show you those later, but you have access to those now. So, one of the biggest questions we get, in this uncertain time, what should we do? We know that we need to do what's best for all students, but I would recommend working with your district administration about plans for the fall and the various options if school is not returning for in-person instruction on day 1. What we do know from the reentry plan that was released last week is that it's going to be 180 days of instruction. So that is something that we know. We're not talking about waiver days or anything along those lines. And we don't know maybe if it's going to be remote learning or face-to-face instruction, but at least what we do know is it should be 180 days. And I think that really will provide a framework for teachers to just begin this planning process. But this is something that they'll edit and tweak along the way. But again, having this framework is a great starting point to make sure that we're hitting the most essential skills. So again, the 180 days is something that's, at least there's something set in stone. So these calendars will be really fluid and flexible. And we'll get to that later as well. And then now we're going to look at step 5. So now that, once you've actually done this step and identified how many days you're working with, you need to look at all those standards you identified with Diane, those essential ones that you said were high priority, and figure out how many instructional days they're going to take. This is really probably going to be an estimation because things happen, but to the right, you'll see the math and literacy frameworks linked again. The reason I linked those there is because they have those I can statements or learning targets, and you're able to kind of get an idea of how many pieces are in this standard. If you see that there's 5 I can statements, that means with that standard, students have to master 5 separate things. So that's something that's going to take a significant amount of time. So that can just help give you a better idea of how long some of these standards may take to deliver instruction on. And, the Google Sheet that you are, or if you use something similar that Diane referenced in the beginning, that could be really vital when getting to this step as well, because That's necessary because you and your team have to consider, the previous year's standard, if it's really linked to your high priority standard that you need to address, in a bell ring or a review or pre-test or even something small. Um, but I cannot say this enough, is that we can talk about those previous year standards and do quick reviews, quick things with them, but students have to be introduced to the grade level content, and that has to be the focus of their instruction. So that's something I just want you to keep in the back of your mind for all of this, to not go through and review for the first couple weeks of school. And we'll talk more about that in the deeper dive next week as well. So in this final step, this is really the most time consuming of the calendar steps, I would say, because you're taking a lot of different things into consideration. Here's where you're actually going to prioritize the standards, the ones that you said were high priority, and how are you going to map them out on your calendar, accounting for assessments. So when mapping standards out, obviously you've got to limit your focus. We usually recommend around 1 to 2 high priority standards a month. And please, this is not to say that other medium and lesser priority standards cannot be incorporated in these, but your main focus should really be those 1 to 2 high priority standards. It's critical also, this is the time where we're thinking about prerequisite skills and using the Google Sheet from earlier in the presentation. Another thing on this step to consider is intervention and remediation. What are you going to do with the students who are not mastering the content? How will you set aside time for them? Some schools have time built into their school day for intervention and remediation, and this is amazing. It is best practice, and it is recommended that this time really be built in before the school year begins. Another piece of this, and we'll get more into that as well, because there's a lot that goes with that, but another piece of this is the scheduling of assessments. So we always recommend that assessments should occur every 3 to 4 weeks, around that time frame. Remember that you don't need to necessarily formally assess every single standard, but if you're going to deem something as high priority and really critical for your students, it is something that you want a common formative assessment for, or a CFA. And these common formative assessments should be common across grade level, if you have multiple teachers teaching the same grade level, and they should also have common timing and a common grading rubric. Having common timing is going to help if you have PLCs at your school to really have data discussions talking about how students performed on the assessment. So you really want to give them an assessment window, and then you'll be able to discuss that data further. There will be upcoming professional development on these common formative assessments from our office, so be on the lookout for that. One final thing on this, when you're completing this step, and then we have some work time next week, that if there's any change to this calendar, it really needs to be a group decision and a grade level decision. When I was in the classroom, our PLC had a couple knockdown dragouts about changing the instructional calendar, because you really need to get everyone up. And so every time, if an assessment needs to be moved, a standard needs to be moved, or needs more time, then you need to come to that agreement together. I wanted to provide a couple of examples, and you'll see a lot more actually next week, but here you'll see a snapshot of 3rd grade ELA calendar. You see that there are 2 high priority standards that are being addressed this month. These 2 standards are being addressed together because they kind of go hand in hand. You've got one of them is point of view, you see POV on there, and the other one is evaluating arguments. So they'll be taught in unison. You can also see that the CFA, or common assessment, is scheduled at the end of the month. Now, to the right of the calendar, you'll see a lot of the links we discussed throughout the presentation, and it'll just help so you don't have to go on a scavenger hunt looking for things. You have really easy access to a lot of IDOE resources over there. But take note of this sample calendar, 8th grade math. It's the top right one. I'll go into this next week, but this is an example of an electronic calendar for math. You'll see color coding based on the priority of the standard, if it's high, medium, or low, as well as scheduled assessment date. Again, this is just another way to pace out essential standards, so just providing some examples with that. And again, there's many ways to map them out. Once you've mapped them out on a calendar, something like you see here, this chart, this sample pacing guide, is a really easy way to organize your calendar. Again, it's a sample, but you can see that the teachers mapped out when their assessment window would be, the number of days that each unit would take, the standards that would be the focus during those times. And I've seen tons and tons of school add another column at the end that talks about the resources that they're going to use for that unit. So again, just using what works best. And this is really, a tool like this could be so beneficial if you have, a lot of new teachers coming in, to give them a framework of where to begin. Well, that concludes our quick overview. Again, we want to emphasize that this is a process, and next week we're going to go further in depth on all these ideas. So we highly recommend bringing any materials that you want, whether it's your standards or maybe a calendar that you've created in the past or a previous list of high priority standards, whatever you will need next week. And we want to thank you so much for the time today, and we're here to support you in any way possible. You'll see our school improvement team on the screen, and feel free to reach out to us for any support or further questions. Again, next week, we encourage you to be a part of that too and come to our deeper dive. And you should have already been sent those links. If you were not sent the links for the sessions next week, please reach out to one of us. And finally, our last thing is, our team wants to ensure that we keep our professional development really meaningful and timely. So you'll see a feedback link. It's really quick. So if you were able to provide any sort of feedback to our team, we would greatly appreciate it. And we want to thank you again for all your time, and we'll turn it over and see if there are any questions.
Hey, Sarah, Diane, no questions today. Another excellent presentation, ladies. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Scott.